Captain Jin-Ho sat in the dark corner of the cantina on Nexus Station, watching the crowd of alien soldiers around him. The station was the biggest military hub in this part of the galaxy, and tonight it was packed with warriors from every corner of known space. The air smelled like a mix of different atmospheres, and the sound of dozens of languages filled the room. He took another sip of his drink and tried to focus on anything except the memories that kept coming back. The blue-skinned Altarians at the next table were laughing about their latest victory against some pirates, while a group of reptilian saurid warriors compared scars from their recent battles. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure of their place in the Galactic order, but Jin-Ho knew something they did not. He had seen what real warfare looked like when humans were involved, and it changed everything. The cantina door slid open, and Sergeant Hai Jin walked in, still wearing her combat armor from the transport ship. She spotted Jin-Ho immediately and made her way through the crowd. Her face showed the same tired expression that all soldiers wore after a long mission, but there was something else there too, a kind of nervous energy that Jin-Ho recognized, dropped into the chair across from him and signaled the bartender for a drink. The mechanical server rolled over on its wheels and took her order while she studied Jin-Ho with concern in her eyes. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "What happened? On that last mission with the exchange program, I heard you were working with some new species." Jin-Ho nodded slowly. The Galactic Military Exchange Program was supposed to help different species learn from each other, share tactics, and build stronger alliances. He had volunteered because he wanted to see how other warriors fought and maybe learn something useful for his own people. "I was assigned to work with humans," he said quietly. "Specifically Americans." The word hung in the air between them, like a curse. Hai Jin leaned back in her chair, and her expression changed. She had heard the stories, too. Everyone in the military had heard whispers about the humans, but most people assumed they were just rumors. "You actually worked with them?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Are the stories true?" Before Jin-Ho could answer, a loud crash came from across the cantina. A massive Corvan warrior had apparently said something offensive to a table of Zenith Federation officers, and now both groups were standing up ready to fight. The Corvan was twice the size of any of the Zenith soldiers, and his natural armor plating made him look like a living tank. The other patrons started backing away, giving the fighters room. Nobody wanted to get caught in the middle of an interspecies brawl. The Corvan cracked his knuckles and grinned, showing rows of sharp teeth, while the Zenith officers activated their energy weapons. Then something interesting happened. A human soldier who had been sitting quietly at the bar turned around and looked at the situation. She was small compared to everyone else in the fight, maybe 5.5 feet tall with no obvious weapons or armor. She walked over to the Corvan warrior and said something too quiet for Jin-Ho to hear. The massive alien looked down at her and started laughing. He said something back that made his friends chuckle, and the Zenith officers gripped their weapons tighter. The human woman nodded politely, and then did something that made Jin-Ho spill his drink. She moved so fast that most people in the cantina missed it. One moment she was standing calmly next to the Corvan. The next moment he was on the floor gasping for breath while she dusted off her hands. The entire fight was over in less than 3 seconds. The human woman helped the Corvan back to his feet with a friendly smile and bought him a drink. The Zenith officers put away their weapons, looking confused and impressed. The rest of the cantina slowly went back to their conversations, but Jin-Ho noticed that everyone was now very aware of where the human was sitting. "That is what they are like," Hyejin whispered to Jin-Ho. "They make everything look easy." Jin-Ho shook his head. The fight was impressive, but it was not. What made humans dangerous? Physical abilities could be enhanced with technology or genetic modification. What made Americans terrifying was something much deeper and more disturbing. The human woman noticed Jin-Ho watching her and walked over to their table. She moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who never worried about threats, because she was usually the most dangerous thing in any room. "Mind if I join you?" she asked in perfect Galactic standard. "I could not help but notice you." Mentioning Americans earlier, Jin gestured to an empty chair. The human sat down and introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Kim. She had the kind of friendly, casual manner that made people want to trust her, which Jin-Ho now knew was probably the most dangerous thing about her. "I heard you were part of the exchange program," she said to Jin-Ho. "Which unit did you work with?" "The 47th Tactical Response Group," he replied carefully. "On Kepler." Prime Lieutenant Kim nodded thoughtfully. That was Colonel. "Yuri unit, good people, very professional. Did you learn anything interesting?" The way she asked the question seemed innocent enough, but Jin-Ho caught something underneath the casual tone. She was gathering information even during what appeared to be friendly conversation. He realized that every human interaction was probably a form of intelligence gathering. "It was educational," he said diplomatically. The lieutenant smiled, and Jin-Ho felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same expression he had seen on Colonel Yuri's face during their mission briefings, a look that suggested she knew things that other people did not want to know. "You know what I find interesting about working with other species," she said conversationally. "Most of them approach warfare like it is some kind of sporting event with rules and honor codes and expectations about how enemies should behave." Jin frowned. "What do you mean?" "Americans learned a long time ago that the only rule in war is that there are no rules," Kim replied, still smiling. "People who expect their enemies to fight fair usually end up dead. The galaxy has been very peaceful for a long time, and most species have forgotten what real warfare looks like." She finished her drink and stood up, stretching like someone getting ready for a workout, rather than someone who had just casually disabled a warrior twice her size. "If you will excuse me, I need to get back to my unit. We ship out in a few hours for the Outer Rim. There are some pirates out there who apparently think they can raid human shipping routes." The way she said it made Jin-Ho certain that the pirates were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between raiding other species and threatening Americans. After she left, Jin stared at Jin-Ho with wide eyes. "What was that about?" she asked. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Jin-Ho watched the human lieutenant disappear into the crowd. She moved through the other soldiers like water flowing around rocks, never bumping into anyone, never seeming to hurry, but somehow getting where she wanted to go faster than anyone else. That, he said quietly, is why Americans are the most feared species in the galaxy. They do not just fight wars, they study them perfect, and turn them into art forms. And the scariest part is that they actually enjoy it. Her thought about everything he had witnessed during his time with the 47th Tactical Response Group. The casual way they discussed strategies that would give other species nightmares. Their complete lack of hesitation when faced with impossible odds. The disturbing enthusiasm they showed for solving problems that other people considered hopeless. Jin leaned forward. "Tell me what happened on Kepler." "Prime," she said, "I need to know what we are dealing with." Jin-Ho looked around the cantina at all the confident alien warriors drinking and laughing and sharing stories about their victories. None of them understood that the rules of galactic warfare had already changed. They were still playing the old game while Americans had invented a completely new one. Tomorrow, he would file his official report with Galactic Command. Tonight, he would tell Jin the truth about what humans were really capable of when someone was foolish enough to threaten them. Jin-Ho settled back in his chair and began his story while Jin listened with growing concern. The cantina noise faded into the background as he remembered those first days working with the American unit. 3 months ago, I was assigned to Kepler. Prime as part of the exchange program, he said. The planet had been having problems with raiders from the Vorthon Syndicate. These were not ordinary pirates, but organized military forces that had been hitting supply convoys and civilian settlements. The Galactic Defense Force had tried everything. Standard patrol routes, defensive positions, even negotiating with the syndicate leadership. Nothing worked. The Vorthans kept getting bolder, and their attacks were becoming more frequent and more brutal command. Decided to try something new. They brought in specialists from different species to create a joint task force. I was representing our people, along with warriors from 6 other worlds. We were supposed to learn from each other and develop new tactics to deal with the problem. When the American transport ship arrived, Jin-Ho continued, I was expecting something impressive. Instead, their vessel looked almost primitive compared to our advanced cruisers. It was smaller than most civilian freighters, and appeared to be held together with spare parts and determination. The Americans who came off that ship looked just as unremarkable. Their equipment seemed basic. Their uniforms were simple and practical, rather than ceremonial, and their weapons appeared to be standard infantry gear, nothing special or advanced about any of it. Colonel Yuri was their commanding officer, a woman in her 40s who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had been fighting wars since childhood. She introduced her team with casual friendliness that made everyone relax around them. This is Major Dongwu, our intelligence specialist, she said, pointing to a quiet man who seemed to notice everything. Sergeant Min Kyung handles our technical operations. Corporal Jamin is our communications expert, and Lieutenant Subin coordinates our field operations. The other species representatives were polite, but clearly unimpressed. The Altarian commander made some comments about primitive human technology, while the Saurid warriors questioned whether Earth forces would be useful in a real military operation. Colonel Yuri just smiled and suggested they get started with mission planning. That was when things began to get interesting. The briefing room had holographic displays showing the entire Kepler system with detailed information about Vorthon movements and attack patterns. The alien commanders began discussing traditional military responses, patrol schedules, defensive fortifications, and direct confrontation tactics. But the Americans were asking completely different questions. Major Dongwu wanted to know about Vorthon family structures, their cultural traditions, and their methods of recruiting new members. Sergeant Min Kyung asked about their supply chains, not their military ones, but how they fed their families and maintained their equipment. Why do you need to know what they eat for breakfast? Asked the Altarian commander. This is a military operation, not a cultural exchange. Colonel. Yuri looked at him with that unsettling smile Jin-Ho was beginning to recognize. Commander warfare is not just about shooting at each other until one side gives up. Real victory comes from understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves. She activated her own datapad and began showing information that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. The Americans had already been studying the Vorthons for weeks. They knew the names of key leaders, their personal histories, their family connections, and their individual psychological profiles. How did you gather all this intelligence? Asked the Saurid war leader. Our best scouts have been trying to penetrate Vorthon security for months. Lieutenant Subin laughed. We did not penetrate anything. We just looked at publicly available information, social networks, trade records, communication patterns, shipping manifests. Most species put their entire lives on display without realizing it. The Americans had built detailed psychological profiles of every major Vorthan leader. They knew who was ambitious, who was cautious, who had gambling debts, and who was having problems with their family. They had identified internal power struggles within the syndicate and mapped out the personal relationships between different commanders. This is impressive intelligence gathering, said the Altarian commander grudgingly. But how does knowing about their personal problems help us in battle? Corporal Jamin pulled up a new display showing communication intercepts. The Vorthons think they are fighting a military campaign against scattered defenders. What they do not know is that we have been listening to their private conversations for 3 weeks. The intercepted messages revealed everything: planned attack, routes, supply schedules, internal disputes between different Vorthan factions, and most importantly, detailed discussions about their families back home. The syndicate leadership keeps their families on heavily defended worlds far from the fighting, Colonel Yuri explained. They think this makes them safe from retaliation, but it also means they are emotionally invested in protecting those worlds. She looked around the room at the confused alien faces. You see, the Vorthans have made the same mistake that most species make. They assume that everyone fights the same way they do. They expect us to target their military forces, attack their strategic positions, and eventually negotiate some kind of settlement. But Americans do not fight that. Major Dongwu said quietly, "We fight to win permanently, completely, and in ways that make sure the problem never comes back." The alien commanders were beginning to look uncomfortable. The Saurid war leader asked the question that everyone was thinking, what exactly are you proposing? Colonel Yuri smiled again, and Jinho felt that familiar chill. We are going to teach the Vorthons why threatening American interests is the worst mistake they will ever make. And we are going to do it in a way that every other potential enemy in this sector will remember for a very long time. She began outlining a plan that was unlike anything the alien commanders had ever heard. It did not involve direct military confrontation or even traditional warfare. Instead, the Americans wanted to systematically destroy the Vorthons' ability to function as an organization while simultaneously turning their own people against them. The first phase would involve disrupting their communication networks, not by jamming them, but by feeding false information through their own systems. The second phase would target their supply lines in ways that would look like accidents or incompetence rather than sabotage. The final phase was what made the alien commanders truly nervous. The Americans wanted to broadcast selected intelligence about Vorton operations to their home worlds, specifically information about planned attacks on civilian targets, and the callous way their leaders talked about acceptable. Casualties, you want to turn their families against them? Asked the Altarian commander in disbelief. Sergeant Min Kyung nodded. It is much easier to defeat an enemy when their own people want them to stop fighting. Wars end quickly when soldiers start, getting calls from home asking them to come back, as Jinho finished describing the American plan. Hyejin stared at him with a mixture of fascination and horror. That is not warfare, she said quietly. That is something else entirely. Jinho nodded. That was just the beginning. What happened next showed us that Americans do not just think differently about war. They think differently about everything. The next morning, Jinho continued. The Americans began putting their plan into action, while the rest of the task force watched in amazement. The alien commanders had expected to see traditional military preparations troops moving into position, weapons being distributed, and defensive measures being established. Instead, the Americans seemed to disappear. Major Dongwu and his intelligence team simply vanished from the base camp. They did not take military transports or use official channels. One day they were there. The next day they were gone. When the Altarian commander asked where they had gone, Colonel Yuri just said they were doing their jobs. Sergeant Min Kyung set up what looked like a civilian electronics repair shop in the main trading port on Kepler Prime. She hung out a sign advertising services for communication devices and computer systems. Within hours, she had a steady stream of customers, including several off-duty Vorthan raiders who needed their personal equipment fixed. The alien commanders were confused. Why was she wasting time repairing civilian electronics when they should be preparing for battle? She is not repairing anything, Lieutenant Subin explained with that unsettling American smile. She is installing, monitoring software in every device that comes through her shop. In 3 days, she will have access to half the personal communication networks in this system. Corporal Jae-min had set up his own operation. He was working as a cargo handler at the main spaceport, loading and unloading ships that came through the system. It looked like ordinary manual labor, but he was actually installing tiny tracking devices in supply containers and recording detailed information about shipping schedules. A Saurid war leader was growing impatient. "This is taking too long," she complained. "We should be striking at their military targets while we have the element of surprise." Colonel Yuri looked at her with amusement. "Commander, you are thinking like prey. We are not trying to surprise them. We want them to know we are here. We want them to make mistakes." As if summoned by her words, alarms began blaring throughout the base. A Vorthan attack force had been detected approaching the system. 3 heavy cruisers and a dozen escort ships were heading directly for Kepler Prime. The alien commanders immediately began preparing defensive positions and calling for reinforcements. This was exactly the kind of direct military confrontation they understood and were trained for. But the Americans had different ideas. "Let them come," Colonel Yuri said calmly. "Major Dongwu should be in position by now, and our other preparations are ready. This will be educational." The Vorthan fleet arrived in the system, with typical aggressive posturing. They broadcast demands for surrender, threatened to destroy civilian targets, and began moving into attack formation. It was standard pirate intimidation designed to make defenders panic and surrender without a fight. Colonel Yuri activated the communication system and responded to their demands in a calm, professional voice. "This is Colonel Yuri of the Terran Defense Force," she said. "We decline your offer to surrender. However, we would like to share some information that might interest you." What followed was unlike anything the alien commanders had ever witnessed. The Americans began broadcasting detailed intelligence about the Vorthan force. Not military intelligence, but personal information about every officer and crew member in the attacking fleet. They knew the names of the Vorthan commander children and where they went to school. They had recordings of his wife complaining about his drinking problem. They broadcast his personal financial records showing massive gambling debts and evidence that he had been stealing from his own crew. But that was just the beginning. The Americans had similar information about every senior officer in the fleet. They knew about affairs, medical problems, family disputes, and personal secrets that the Vorthans thought were completely private. The effect on the attacking fleet was immediate and devastating. Vorthan commanders found themselves trying to maintain military discipline while their crews learned that their officers had been lying to them, stealing from them, and treating them as expendable. Ship-to-ship communications in the Vorthan fleet became chaotic as crew members demanded explanations from their officers. Some ships broke formation. As internal disputes erupted, others began broadcasting demands that their commanders explain where stolen funds had gone. The Altarian commander watched the enemy fleet falling apart and turned to Colonel Yuri in amazement. "How did you get all that information?" he asked. Major Dongwu's voice came over the communication system, sounding relaxed and professional. "Sir, we have been monitoring their personal communications for 3 weeks. Most of these officers have been sending messages to their families complaining about each other and discussing things they probably should have kept secret. But that was not the end of the American strategy. While the Vorthan fleet was dealing with internal chaos, Sergeant Min Kyung activated the monitoring devices she had installed in civilian equipment. Throughout the system, Vorthan personal communication devices began broadcasting embarrassing messages and private information. Corporal J. Min triggered the tracking devices he had planted. In supply containers, Vorthan logistics officers suddenly discovered that their secret supply caches were no longer secret and that their carefully planned resource distribution had been completely compromised. Within 2 hours, the attacking Vorthan fleet was in complete disarray. 3 ships had mutinies in progress. 2 commanders had been arrested by their own crews, and the remaining vessels were trying to retreat while dealing with massive internal problems. Not a single shot had been fired. Webb. Alien commanders stared at the tactical display, showing the Vorthan fleet limping away from the system in confusion and defeat. The Saurid war leader asked the question that everyone was thinking: what exactly did we just witness? Lieutenant Subin smiled. "You saw Americans fight a war the way we learned to fight them, by making the enemy defeat themselves." Jinho nodded. "But that was just the beginning. The Vorthans made the mistake of trying to get revenge. And that was when we learned what Americans are really capable of when someone makes them angry." 2 weeks after the first Vorthan fleet retreated, Jinho continued his story. The syndicate leadership made a decision that sealed their fate. they decided that the humans needed to be taught a lesson about the consequences of humiliating Vorthan. Warriors. The alien commanders at Kepler Prime received intelligence reports about massive Vorthan military buildup in 3 nearby systems. The Syndicate was assembling the largest fleet they had ever put together. Nearly 200 ships, including some of their most advanced battlecruisers and their most experienced commanders. "This is what we were afraid of," said the Altarian commander during an emergency briefing. "They are bringing everything they have. We need to evacuate the civilian population and call for massive reinforcements." The Saurid war leader agreed. The humans embarrassed them, and now they want revenge. "We cannot possibly fight a fleet that size with our current forces," but Colonel Yuri seemed almost pleased by the news. "Excellent," she said. "This is exactly what we were hoping for." The alien commanders stared at her in disbelief. "Hoping for?" asked the Altarian commander. "They are bringing enough firepower to destroy this entire system, Colonel." Yuri activated a holographic display, showing the Vorthan fleet movements. "You are thinking like defenders again?" she said. "We are not going to fight them here. We are going to fight them everywhere." What she meant by that became clear over the next few days. The Americans began implementing what they called a distributed campaign strategy. Instead of concentrating their forces to defend Kepler Prime, they scattered into tiny groups and disappeared throughout the sector major. Dongwu took a small team and headed for the Vorthan home. Systems Lieutenant Subin led another group toward their primary supply bases. Sergeant Min Kyung and Corporal Jae-min went in completely different directions with missions that Colonel Yuri did not explain to the alien commanders. "We should be coordinating our efforts," protested the Saurid war leader. "How can we maintain communication and tactical coordination if everyone is scattered across the galaxy? Coordination is overrated." Colonel Yuri replied, "Americans learned long ago that small, independent groups can accomplish more than large, organized forces. The key is making sure everyone understands the overall objective." "And what exactly is the overall objective?" asked the Altarian commander to make the Vorthans understand that threatening Americans was the biggest mistake of their lives. Yuri said simply, "We are going to destroy their ability to function as an organization, and we are going to do it in ways that will make every other species in this sector think twice before challenging human interests." The alien commanders wanted to protest, but before they could say anything, reports began coming in from across the sector. Vorthan supply convoys were disappearing, not destroyed but simply vanishing, without any distress signals or evidence of what had happened to them. Vorthan communication networks were experiencing massive failures, but not from jamming or direct attack. Instead, their own systems were broadcasting embarrassing personal information about their leadership. To anyone who cared to listen, most disturbing of all, Vorthan families back home were receiving detailed packages of information about their relatives' military activities. These were not threats, but simply factual reports about planned raids on civilian targets, callous discussions about acceptable casualties, and evidence of various war crimes. The effect on Vorthan society was immediate and devastating. Families began demanding that their military relatives come home. Civilian populations started questioning why they were supporting an organization that seemed to enjoy causing unnecessary suffering. Political leaders found themselves having to explain why their military was so unpopular with their own people. But the Americans were just getting started. Major Dongwu team had infiltrated the Vorthan home systems and was systematically sabotaging their infrastructure, not with explosives or direct attacks, but by introducing subtle flaws into their computer systems that would cause critical failures at the worst possible moments. Transportation networks began experiencing mysterious breakdowns that left Vorthan military units stranded without supplies. Medical systems developed glitches that resulted in incorrect diagnoses and treatment failures. Communication networks started routing important military messages to random civilian addresses. Lieutenant Subin's team was conducting what the Americans called economic warfare. They were not attacking Vorthon financial systems directly, but instead manipulating market conditions to make Vorthon currency worthless and their trade relationships unstable. Within a month, the Vorthon economy was in free fall. Their currency had lost 90% of its value. Their trade partners were refusing to do business with them, and their government was facing massive civil unrest as ordinary citizens demanded to know why their lives were being destroyed. Sergeant Min Kyung and Corporal Jamin were implementing what Colonel Yuri called psychological operations. They were spreading carefully crafted rumors and false information through Vorthon social networks, creating paranoia, distrust, and confusion throughout their society. Vorthon military commanders found themselves unable to trust their own intelligence reports because they could not tell which information was real and which had been planted by American operatives. Ordinary citizens became suspicious of their neighbors because they had heard stories about infiltrators and saboteurs. The massive Vorthon fleet that had been assembled to destroy Kepler Prime never even made it into battle. Most of the ships experienced critical system failures while in transit. Others were recalled to defend Vorthon, home systems that were experiencing mysterious problems. The few ships that did reach their target found that the Americans had prepared additional surprises. Their approach routes had been seeded with devices that interfered with their navigation systems. Their communication networks had been compromised so that their commanders were receiving false orders from their own headquarters. When the Vorthon fleet finally limped back to their home systems, they found a society in complete chaos. Their government was collapsing. Their economy was destroyed, their military was in mutiny, and their civilian population was demanding an end to the conflict. The alien commanders at Kepler Prime watched the systematic destruction of the Vorthon syndicate with a mixture of amazement and horror. In less than 2 months, the Americans had reduced a major military power to a failed state without fighting a single conventional battle. "How is this possible?" asked the Altarian commander. They had hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, and control over dozens of star systems. Colonel Yuri smiled that disturbing smile that Jin Ho had learned to fear. "Commander, the Vorthons made the mistake of thinking that military power comes from ships and weapons. Americans learned a long time ago that real power comes from understanding how societies work and knowing how to break them." Jin Ho nodded. "And that was when I realized that the stories about Americans were not exaggerated. They were incomplete." The final phase of the operation, Jin Ho continued, was when the Americans revealed something that changed how I think about warfare forever. After the Vorthon syndicate had collapsed, Colonel Yuri called a meeting with all the alien commanders who had witnessed the campaign. "I want to show you something," she said, activating a holographic display that showed detailed statistics about the entire operation. "These numbers will help you understand what you have just witnessed." The display showed casualty figures that made the alien commanders stare in disbelief. In 2 months of systematic warfare against a major military organization, the Americans had achieved complete victory with total casualties of exactly 0. No American soldiers had been killed or even seriously wounded. No civilian populations had been harmed. No infrastructure had been permanently damaged. Even the Vorthon casualties were minimal, mostly injuries from internal conflicts and civil unrest rather than direct military action. "This is impossible," said the Saurid war leader. "You destroyed an entire syndicate. How can there be no casualties?" "Colonel," Yuri looked at her with that expression. Jin Ho had learned to recognize the look of someone explaining something. Obvious to a child, Americans do not fight wars to kill people. She said, "We fight wars to solve problems. The most efficient solution is usually the one that involves the least amount of actual violence." She changed the display to show a comparison. With traditional military campaigns, a conventional assault on the Vorthon syndicate would have required months of battles, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and massive destruction of civilian infrastructure. Even if successful, it would have left the region destabilized and created new problems. Instead, the Americans had surgically removed the syndicate leadership, neutralized their military capability, and left their territory ready for peaceful integration into the galactic community. The former Vorthon worlds were already requesting alliance membership and asking for help rebuilding their damaged economies. But the most disturbing revelation came when Colonel Yuri showed them the timeline for the operation. The systematic destruction of the Vorthon Syndicate had not begun when the American unit arrived at Kepler Prime. It had begun 6 months earlier. "We have been planning this campaign since we first learned about the Vorthon problem," she explained. "The exchange program assignment was just the final phase. Everything you have seen was the result of careful preparation and detailed intelligence gathering." Major Dongwu appeared on the communication screen looking relaxed, despite having just finished dismantling an entire civilization. "We identified the Vorthon Syndicate as a threat to regional stability 6 months ago," he reported. "Since then, we have been systematically penetrating their networks, studying their society, and preparing for this operation." The alien commanders realized that they had been watching the end of a process that had begun long before they were even aware that Americans existed. Every move the humans had made, every piece of intelligence they had gathered, every seemingly spontaneous tactical decision had been part of a plan that was months in the making. "How many other operations like this are you conducting?" asked the Altarian commander in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Subin smiled. "Americans are always conducting operations like this," she said. "We identify potential threats, study them, prepare countermeasures, and position ourselves to deal with problems before they become serious. We like to be proactive." Sergeant Min Kyung added something that made Jin Ho blood run cold. "The Vorthon operation was actually fairly small scale," she said. "We have much larger projects running in other sectors. Most of them involve potential threats that do not even know they are being studied yet." The alien commanders looked at each other with growing alarm. The implications of what they were hearing were staggering. Americans were not just reactive defenders waiting for threats to emerge. They were actively managing galactic politics on a scale that no one else was. Even aware of Corporal J. Min provided the final piece of information that made everything clear. "Americans have been doing this for centuries," he said. "On our home world, we learned that the best way to maintain peace is to make sure that potential aggressors understand the consequences of aggression before they try anything." What he meant by that became obvious when Colonel Yuri showed them historical records from Earth. The humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of warfare until they reached a point where major conflicts became too expensive and destructive to be practical. "So we learned to prevent wars instead of just winning them," she explained. "When potential enemies understand that conflict with Americans will result in their complete destruction, they usually choose cooperation instead." The alien commanders sat in stunned silence as they absorbed what they had learned. Americans had not just defeated the Vorthon Syndicate. They had demonstrated to every species in the galaxy that challenging human interests would result in swift, systematic, and total destruction. And they had done it in a way that made their victims grateful for the experience. The former Vorthon worlds were already praising American efficiency and requesting closer ties with Earth. The operation had been so successful that it looked like humanitarian assistance rather than military conquest. But the most terrifying realization was that this was normal for Americans. They approached every potential conflict with the same systematic thoroughness that other species might use for scientific research. They studied their enemies better than their enemies understood themselves, and they prepared countermeasures for threats that had not even materialized. Yet, as Jin Ho finished describing the final briefing, Hye Jin stared at him with an expression of pure horror. "They have been managing galactic politics without anyone knowing about it," she said. "How long have they been doing this?" Jin Ho shrugged. Based on what I observed, probably since they first made contact with other species, Americans do not just react to threats, they anticipate them, neutralize them, and position themselves to prevent future problems. He looked around the cantina at all the alien soldiers drinking and celebrating their various victories. None of them understood that their entire civilization existed at the pleasure of a species that could destroy them without effort whenever it became convenient. And the worst part, he added quietly, is that they actually seemed to enjoy it. Jinho finished his story and sat back in his chair watching He-Jin process everything he had told her. Around them, the cantina continued its normal evening routine with alien soldiers from dozens of species sharing drinks and stories. But now, every conversation seemed different to him because he understood something that most of them did not. The galaxy had changed, and most species had not even noticed. He-Jin finally spoke after several minutes of silence. "So what you are telling me is that Americans have been secretly controlling galactic politics for who knows how long and no one is aware of it." "Not controlling," Jinho corrected. "Managing. There is a difference. Americans do not seem interested in ruling other species. They just want to make sure that galactic civilization develops in ways that serve their interests. But that might be even more terrifying than direct conquest. At least with conquest, you know who your masters are and what they want. Americans operate in ways that make other species think they are making their own decisions." He pointed to a table across the cantina where a group of consortium officers were celebrating some kind of trade agreement. "They probably think they negotiated favorable terms for their people," he said. "But I would bet that somewhere in that agreement are clauses that serve American interests in ways they do not even understand." He-Jin looked around the room with new eyes. How many of these conflicts and agreements and political developments are actually the result of American manipulation? "Probably most of them," Jinho replied. "Americans have had centuries to perfect these techniques. They understand how to influence other species in ways that are completely invisible to the targets." As if to prove his point, a human officer walked into the cantina and was immediately approached by representatives from 3 different species. They all seemed eager to talk to her to get her opinion on various matters, and to invite her to join their conversations. She moved through the room like a celebrity, accepting invitations, declining others, and somehow managing to make everyone feel special while gathering information from every conversation. The American was clearly the most popular person in the cantina, despite being from a species that most aliens had never heard of 6 months ago. "Watch how she operates," Jinho said quietly. "She is not just socializing. She is conducting intelligence gathering and influence operations disguised as friendly conversation." The human officer stopped at their table and smiled pleasantly. "Mind if I sit down?" she asked. "I could not help but notice you discussing recent operations. I am always interested in learning from other species' experiences." This was Lieutenant Commander Park Soo-jin from the 23rd Strategic Planning Group. She had the same friendly, casual manner that Jinho had learned to associate with Americans who were much more dangerous than they appeared. "We were just discussing the Vorthon situation," He-Jin said carefully. Soo-jin nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting case study," she said. "The syndicate leadership made several critical mistakes in their approach to regional expansion. Most importantly, they failed to understand that sustainable power requires the consent of the governed." She spoke about the Vorton collapse as if it had been a natural disaster rather than the result of systematic American intervention. Her analysis was accurate and insightful, but completely ignored the role that her own people had played in destroying the syndicate. The way she discussed it made it sound like the Americans had simply observed the situation and perhaps provided some minor assistance to local forces who were already planning to deal with the problem. It was a masterful example of what Jinho had learned to recognize as American information management. What made it even more impressive was that she was probably not even lying. Everything she said was technically accurate. She just left out the parts that would make Americans look like the architects of the syndicate destruction rather than helpful observers. After she left, Hyojin stared at Jin-Ho with a new understanding. She was rewriting history right in front of us, she said. In a few years, everyone will remember the Vorthan collapse as an internal political failure rather than an American military operation. Jin-Ho nodded, and that is how they maintain their influence. By making sure that other species never fully understand what Americans are capable of, they want to be seen as helpful allies rather than dangerous predators. But the truth was that Americans were both helpful allies and dangerous predators, depending on which side of their interests you found yourself. They were perfectly capable of being generous, supportive partners to species that chose to cooperate with them. The problem was that cooperation with Americans meant accepting their definition of what was reasonable and beneficial, and their definition always seemed to involve outcomes that served American strategic objectives. The cantina door opened again, and another group of human soldiers entered. These were clearly combat veterans, returning from some kind of successful mission. They looked tired but satisfied, and they moved with the confident ease of people who had never met a problem they could not solve. What scared Jin-Ho most was how normal they looked. These were not obviously superhuman warriors or technologically enhanced soldiers. They were just ordinary people who happened to come from a species that had turned warfare into a form of applied psychology. Every other species in the galaxy had developed military technologies and tactical doctrines that reflected their particular advantages and limitations. But Americans had developed something much more fundamental. They had learned to understand their enemies better than their enemies understood themselves. And they had done it by fighting each other for thousands of years until they reached a level of strategic sophistication that other species could barely comprehend. They did not just study military history. They lived it, breathed it, and turned it into instinctive knowledge that informed every decision they made. As the evening continued, more stories filtered through the cantina social networks. 3 more pirate organizations had mysteriously disbanded after encountering American forces. The Hegemony Council had quietly revised their expansion plans following consultations with human advisors. The Trade Federation had suddenly become much more reasonable in their negotiations after American economists had reviewed their proposals. None of these developments were reported as American victories. They were all presented as natural political evolution or internal decision-making. But Jin-Ho now understood that Americans had probably been influencing all of these outcomes through methods that left no obvious fingerprints. The most disturbing part was that this was probably just the beginning. Americans had only recently made contact with galactic civilization. They were still learning about other species, still identifying potential threats and opportunities, still positioning themselves for whatever challenges might emerge. In a few decades, when they had finished mapping the political landscape and understanding the strategic environment, they would probably be in a position to reshape galactic civilization according to their preferences. And the worst part was that other species would probably thank them for it, because Americans were very good at making their interventions look like humanitarian assistance or natural political development. As Jin-Ho and Hyojin prepared to leave the cantina, she asked him one final question. "What do you think we should do with this information?" Jin-Ho considered the question carefully. The smart thing would be to make sure that his people stayed on the American good side and never gave them any reason to consider them a threat. But he also knew that knowledge like this came with responsibilities. Other species deserved to understand what they were dealing with, even if that understanding might be uncomfortable. "I think we need to be very careful about how we share what we know," he said finally. "Americans are not evil, but they are definitely dangerous. And dangerous allies can become dangerous enemies very quickly if they decide you are no longer useful." As they walked through the corridors of Nexus Station, Jin-Ho reflected on how much his worldview had changed in just a few months. He had started the exchange program thinking that he would learn some new tactical techniques and make some useful contacts. Instead, he had discovered that his entire understanding of galactic politics was based on incomplete information. Americans had been reshaping the strategic environment for their own benefit, and they had been doing it so skillfully that most species were completely unaware of their influence. The galaxy was going to be a very different place in the coming years, and the species that adapted quickest to the new reality would be the ones that survived and prospered. Those that failed to understand the change would probably find themselves on the wrong side of American strategic planning, and as the Vorthan Syndicate had learned, that was not a place anyone wanted to be.